The Arizona sun was a merciless god. It beat down on the parched earth, baking the dust into a fine, red powder that coated everything: the rickety saloons, the solemn face of the general store, and the weary souls who called the frontier town of Redemption their home. The name was a bitter joke, spat from the lips of prospectors who found only rock and heathens who found only judgment. For Clara Whitmore, it was simply the end of the line. At 24, Clara carried the stillness of someone who had outlived their own life. Her world had ended a year ago, not with a gentle fade, but with the sharp crack of a rifle shot echoing across a canyon. Her father, Dr. Alistair Whitmore, an army surgeon with hands as steady as the mesas and a heart too soft for the uniform he wore, had been returning from a call to a neighboring fort, an ambush. The official report called it a Navajo raid, a word that painted all members of a proud and desperate people with the same bloody brush. Clara knew better. She knew of the scalp hunters, the white men who killed for bounties, their greed cloaked in the righteous banner of expansion. But in a town like Redemption, such truths were whispers, quickly swallowed by the wind. Now, she lived in the husk of their former life, a small, sturdy adobe hut at the edge of town that her father had used as his clinic. It was a place of ghosts. The scent of carbolic acid and dried herbs still clung to the wooden shelves. His medical texts, bound in worn leather, sat in a neat row, their pages filled with his elegant script. He had taught her everything. From the time she was a girl, more interested in sutures than samplers, he had nurtured her talent. She could set a bone, cleanse a wound, and mix a poultice with a skill that rivaled his own. He'd called her his little sawbones, a term of endearment that now felt like a brand. In Redemption, her skills were both a blessing and a curse. The women might call on her in hushed tones for a difficult birth or a child's fever, pressing a few coins or a fresh-baked loaf into her hands with averted eyes. But in public, they saw her as an oddity, a woman meddling in a man's world, the town's new physician, a portly, whiskey-scented man named Dr. Finch regarded her with open disdain, calling her practice kitchen medicine. The men of the town looked at her with a different kind of calculation. A lone woman, a doctor's daughter, an unmarried spinster, she was a puzzle they didn't care to solve, only possess. She kept to herself, her interactions brief and professional, her heart locked away in a place no one could reach. Her days fell into a quiet, lonely rhythm. Mornings were for tending her small garden of hardy herbs and vegetables. Afternoons were for study, poring over her father's books, keeping his knowledge alive within her. Evenings were for silence, watching the sun bleed across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, so beautiful they hurt to look at. It was a life of waiting, though Clara no longer knew what she was waiting for. The day the sky turned yellow began like any other. A dry heat pressed down from a cloudless sky. But by late afternoon, a strange tension had settled over the town. The air grew thick and still, the silence profound. Horses in the livery stamped and whinnied nervously. Then, on the western horizon, a wall of dust appeared, a roiling, monstrous thing that swallowed the landscape. "Sandstorm!" The cry went up from the street, a familiar note of panic and resignation. Doors slammed shut, wooden shutters were hastily barred. The world outside was about to be scoured clean. Clara moved with practiced efficiency, securing the heavy shutter over her one window and wedging a thick rag under the door. The first gusts of wind hit the small house like a physical blow, rattling the frame. The howl began, a low moan that rose to a deafening shriek. Fine, gritty sand, insidious as smoke, began to seep through invisible cracks, coating her tongue and stinging her eyes. She lit a kerosene lamp, its golden glow a fragile bubble against the raging chaos outside. The storm was a living thing, a furious beast clawing at her little sanctuary. Hours passed. The wind's scream was relentless, a sound that frayed the nerves and made the soul feel small and exposed. Clara sat at her small table, a cup of lukewarm tea untouched before her, her father's anatomy textbook open but unread. She was thinking of him, of how he would have sat calmly through such a storm, perhaps humming a tune, his presence a shield against any fear. Now, the only shield she had was the mud brick walls, and they felt perilously thin. It was then, through a momentary lull in the wind's fury, that she heard it. A sound that did not belong to the storm. A thud, heavy and final, just outside her door, followed by a low groan, almost lost in the returning shriek of the wind. Clara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. It could be anything, a stray animal, a piece of debris torn from a neighboring roof. But the groan, that was human. Her first instinct, born of a year of fear and isolation, was to stay put, to ignore it. Whoever was out there was at the mercy of the storm, and opening her door meant inviting that violence inside. Redemption had taught her that compassion was a liability. But her father's voice echoed in her mind, a gentle but firm rebuke. Asterisk. A physician does not choose his patients. Clara, he answers the call. Her hand trembled as she slid the heavy wooden bar from the door. Bracing herself, she pulled it inward. The storm lunged at her, a solid force of wind and sand that threw her back a step and extinguished her lamp, plunging the room into darkness. The world was a maelstrom of roaring noise and stinging grit. Shielding her eyes with one hand, she peered into the swirling brown chaos. There, not 10 feet from her doorstep, was a shape, a man, half buried in the accumulating sand, lying next to the still form of a horse. He was face down, unmoving. For a terrifying moment, she thought he was dead. But then, another pained groan reached her, a raw sound of agony. Duty won. It always won. Pulling her shawl tighter over her head and mouth, Clara stepped out into the tempest. The wind tore at her, ripping the breath from her lungs. Each step was a battle against an invisible tide. Reaching the man, she knelt, the sand scouring her exposed skin. She grabbed his shoulder to turn him over. The first thing she saw was the blood. A dark, ugly stain spread across his buckskin shirt, originating from a wound high on his left side, just below the ribs. The second thing she saw sent a jolt of pure ice through her veins. His face, though streaked with dirt and blood, was undeniably Native American. His long, black hair was unbound, whipping in the wind. He was Navajo. Every warning, every prejudiced whisper she had ever heard in Redemption, screamed in her head. Asterisk savage, killer, the enemy. He was one of the men they blamed for her father's death, the town marshal. A hard man named Jebediah Kane would hang him without a second thought. Anyone who helped him would be considered a traitor. She should leave him, turn around, go back inside, and bar the door. Let the storm finish what some bullet had started. It was the safe thing to do, the sensible thing. But then he stirred, his eyes fluttering open for a brief second. They were dark, fathomless, and in their depths, she did not see a savage or a killer. She saw pain, raw, unadorned, human pain. In that moment, he was not a Navajo warrior. He was a patient. Her father's words again. A quiet mantra against the storm's roar. Asterisk. You treat the wound, not the man. Her decision was not a thought, but an impulse, a deep-seated instinct she couldn't fight. She would not let him die at her doorstep. Getting him inside was a feat of desperate strength she didn't know she possessed. He was tall and leanly muscled, a dead weight against her smaller frame. She hooked her arms under his, dragging him backward, her boots sinking into the shifting sand. The wind fought her, trying to tear him from her grasp. Grit filled her eyes, blinding her. She moved by instinct, pulling, stumbling, pulling again, until his body was across her threshold. With a final, agonizing heave, She got him fully inside and slammed the door shut, barring it against the storm's fury. For a long moment, she simply lay against the door, gasping for breath, her body screaming with exertion. The only sounds were her own ragged breathing and the muffled howl of the wind. The man lay unconscious on her floor, a dark, dangerous secret bleeding onto her wooden planks. With shaking hands, she found her matches and relit the lamp. The soft light fell upon him, revealing the severity of his condition. His face was etched with lines of pain even in unconsciousness. A deep gash on his forehead oozed blood, and his breathing was shallow and labored. But the wound in his side was the true danger. She was a doctor's daughter. She was a healer. This was her calling, her curse, her inheritance, tearing her eyes from his face. She went to the chest where she'd kept her medical supplies. She pulled out clean linen, her father's sharpest surgical knife, a bottle of whiskey for antiseptic, and a needle and catgut for suturing. As she knelt beside him, she understood the magnitude of her choice. She was not just defying the town of redemption. She was defying the memory of her own grief, the anger and hatred that had been her constant companions for a year. She was choosing her father's humanity over the world's prejudice. She took a deep breath, the scent of dust and rain and blood filling her senses. The storm howled outside, a fitting soundtrack to the tempest that had just erupted within her own life. She was harboring the enemy. She was sheltering a man who, by all rights, she should despise. And in doing so, she had crossed a line from which there would be no return. Her quiet, lonely life was over. Whatever came next, discovery, accusation, danger, it had already begun. Looking down at the wounded warrior, a stranger who now held her fate in his hands, Clara Whitmore picked up a cloth, dipped it in water, and prepared to go to work. The room was an island in a roaring sea of sand and wind. The lamplight cast long, dancing shadows, turning the familiar space into a place of secrets. On the floor lay the source of it all, the Navajo warrior, his life bleeding out onto the rough-hewn planks. Clara pushed aside the fear, the doubt, the spectral voice of the town's prejudice. In this room, she was not Clara Whitmore, the spinster, the oddity. She was Dr. Whitmore's daughter. She was a healer. His buckskin shirt was stiff with dried and fresh blood. It had to be cut away. With a pair of sharp shears from her medical kit, she began to work, the snipping of the blades a small, precise sound against the storm's fury. She cut up from the hem, her fingers brushing against the surprising heat of his skin. He was lean, but powerfully built, his torso a landscape of hard muscle forged by a life she could barely imagine. As she peeled the ruined fabric away from the wound, a sharp hiss of breath escaped his lips, and his body tensed. His eyes opened. They were not clouded with delirium or unfocused with pain. They were dark, intelligent, and fixed on her with a startling intensity. He watched her hands, her face, his gaze of physical weight. A flush crept up Clara's neck. She had tended to dozens of men in her life, ranch hands with broken bones, miners with black lung, soldiers with fevers. She had always maintained a cool, clinical detachment. But this was different. This was not a patient. This was the enemy, and he was watching her with an unnerving awareness. "I have to clean the wound," she said, her voice sounding thin and reedy. "It will hurt." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, his eyes never leaving hers. She took a cloth and dipped it into the basin of warm water she'd prepared. As she reached for the wound, a ragged hole of torn flesh and muscle just below his ribs, she hesitated. To do this properly, she would have to wash away the blood and grime from the surrounding skin. She would have to touch him, intimately and thoroughly. It felt like a profound transgression. "Close your eyes," she whispered. The words were for him, but they were also for herself, a plea for a small shield of anonymity, a way to pretend this was just a wound, not a man. He did not close them. Instead, his gaze intensified, as if her words had challenged him. She saw a flicker of something in their depths: pride, defiance, perhaps even a sliver of dark humor. He was surrendering his body to her care, but not his will. Clara took a shaky breath and set to her task. Asterisk, close your eyes. But the Navajo warrior watched her wash every inch of him. The thought seared itself into her mind, a title for this strange, forbidden chapter of her life. Her touch was professional, yet she was acutely aware of every sensation: the slide of the wet cloth over his skin, the texture of a faint, silvery scar on his abdomen, the tautness of his muscles beneath her fingers. She worked methodically, her father's training a sturdy anchor in a sea of unsettling emotions. She cleaned the edges of the wound, her movements gentle but firm, preparing to probe for the bullet. He did not flinch, did not make a sound, but his breathing deepened. His eyes tracked her every move. She was the one with the instruments, the knowledge, the power to heal or harm. Yet, she felt utterly exposed, laid bare by his silent, unwavering gaze. It was a gaze that acknowledged the profound intimacy of the moment, the stripping away of everything but two people in a room, a man in need and a woman who had answered the call. The barriers of race, of hatred, of a year of bitter grief seemed to be dissolving in the warm, lamp-lit air. She found the bullet. It was lodged against a rib, a flattened piece of lead. Extracting it was a delicate, bloody business. She poured a small amount of whiskey directly into the wound. This time, he couldn't suppress a strangled gasp, his back arching off the floor. His hands shot out, not to stop her, but to grip the edge of the wooden table, his knuckles turning white. Still, he watched her. He watched as she used her father's forceps to carefully work the bullet free. He watched as she stitched the angry lips of the wound together, her needle dipping in and out, pulling his flesh closed. When she was finished, she bandaged him tightly with clean linen. Her work was done. She sat back on her heels, physically and emotionally drained. The storm outside seemed to have quieted, its rage spent. The silence in the room was now heavier, filled with the unspoken things that had passed between them. "Tony," he said. The voice was low and rough from disuse and pain, but clear. It startled her. "What?" He tapped his own chest weakly with his fingers. Tony. It was his name. He was giving her his name. A name was a piece of a soul, a thing of power. It made him real, not just a symbol of her people's enemy. It made her act of saving him personal. "Clara," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then his eyelids, heavy with exhaustion and blood loss, finally drifted shut. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The storm broke with the dawn. Clara awoke stiffly in her chair to a world washed clean and eerily silent. Her first bleary thought was of the man, Tony. He lay on her father's narrow cot, where she had managed to move him in the night. He was breathing evenly, his fever having broken slightly, but his presence filled the small hut, a dangerous and undeniable reality in the pale morning light. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. The horse, she had forgotten the horse. Throwing her door open, she looked out onto a landscape transformed. The wind had sculpted the red dust into soft dunes, and there, partially covered by one of them, was the dead pinto. A bullet hole was visible in its neck. An Indian pony, lying dead at her doorstep. It was a beacon, a signpost for all the trouble that was to come. She had to move it, but how? The animal was a dead weight of over 1,000 pounds. It was impossible. Her mind raced. She could try to bury it, but the ground was sun-baked clay under the sand, and she would be seen. Every minute that passed was another minute for discovery. Her frantic thoughts were cut short by the sound of a voice calling out, "Miss Whitmore, you all right in there?" It was Silas, the blacksmith's boy. a lanky youth of 15 with a perpetually curious expression. He was standing 50 yards away, staring directly at the dead horse. Clara's heart leaped into her throat. "I'm fine. Silas," she called back, forcing a calmness into her voice that she did not feel. "Terrible storm." "Yes, ma'am, looks like it claimed this poor fella," he said, gesturing with his head toward the Pinto. "That an Apache pony?" I don't know," Clara stammered. "It must have collapsed here seeking shelter." It was a weak lie, and she knew it. Silas's eyes narrowed for a second, a flicker of suspicion in their youthful depths. But then he shrugged. "Well, I'll tell Marshal Kane. He'll have someone drag it off before it starts to stink." He tipped his hat and ambled on toward town. Clara watched him go, her blood running cold. She had bought a little time, but the clock was now ticking. The marshal would come. Questions would be asked. By midday, the town was buzzing. The story of the dead Indian pony at the spinster doctor's house traveled faster than fire in a dry field. It twisted and grew with each telling. It wasn't just a horse. It was a warrior's horse. There were tracks. People said, a man's tracks, leading right to her door before the storm wiped them away. Why would a lone woman on the edge of town be the one to find it? What was she hiding? The whispers slithered through the general store, coiled in the dusty air of the saloon, and were exchanged over picket fences. Clara Whitmore, the strange one, the one who kept to herself, the one who read books instead of finding a husband. She was different, and in a town like Redemption, different was dangerous. Late that afternoon, as she was forcing some broth between Tone's dry lips, a heavy knock fell on her door. It wasn't the tentative rap of a neighbor. It was the hard, authoritative knock of the law. Her hand trembled, spilling a drop of broth on the cot. She opened the door to find Marshal Jebediah Kane. He was a tall, raw-boned man with a graying mustache and eyes the color of a winter sky. He was not a cruel man by nature, but he was a man who believed in a simple, brutal order. There were white folks, and there were Indians. The line between them was clear and was to be defended with rope and lead. "Afternoon, Miss Whitmore," he said, his eyes sweeping past her to scan the dim interior of her home. "Marshal," she replied, blocking the doorway with her body as best she could. "Heard you had some excitement out here last night," he said, his tone casual, but his gaze missing nothing. "Only the storm. And a dead horse," he added. "A Navajo pony, by the looks of the markings. Strange for one to end up here. We've had reports, rumors of a small band of Navajo seen near the mesas a few days back. The same ones who hit that army patrol a month ago. We think one of them might have been wounded." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. His eyes bored into her, searching for a crack in her composure. "You're a doctor, of a sort. A wounded man, even a Navajo, might seek out a place like this. You haven't seen anyone asking for help." Every fiber of her being screamed. The lie felt like a physical object lodged in her throat. She could feel Toane's presence behind her, a warm, breathing secret that could get them both killed. She thought of her father, of the stories of Navajo brutality, and for a fleeting, cowardly moment, she considered telling the truth, handing him over, saving herself. But then she remembered the look in his eyes as she'd stitched his wound, the shared moment of vulnerability, the quiet dignity with which he'd given her his name. He was not a rumor. He was a man lying wounded on her cot. She met the marshal's gaze, channeling the quiet strength she had inherited from her father. "Marshal, the only living soul I've seen since yesterday is Silas. If a wounded man had come to my door, I would have done my duty, but I can't report what I haven't seen." Marshal Kane held her gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He was weighing her words, her character, the probability of her lie. To him, she was a respectable, if eccentric, white woman, the daughter of a respected army surgeon. It was almost unthinkable that she would harbor an enemy. Almost. "All right, Miss Whitmore," he said finally, though a shadow of doubt remained in his eyes. "But you keep your door barred. If these savages are in the area, a lone woman is a tempting target. Let us know if you see anything out of the ordinary." He tipped his hat and turned away. Clara watched him walk back toward the town, his shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. She closed the door, her knees feeling weak. She had survived the first test, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that it would not be the last. The rumor was a spark, and Marshal Kane had just fanned the flames. The whole town would be watching her now, and in the cot behind her, the secret she was keeping was just beginning to heal. The days that followed fell into a pattern of tense quiet and whispered words. The world outside Clara's door remained a threat, but inside, it shrank to the dimensions of the small adobe hut. It became a sanctuary, a prison, and a crucible where two worlds, once violently opposed, began to cautiously touch. Tone healed slowly. The fever receded, and the angry red of his wound began to soften into a healing pink. With returning strength came a profound stillness. He would watch her for hours, his dark eyes following her as she ground herbs, kneaded dough, or simply sat reading by the window, her body angled to see anyone approaching from the town. The silence between them was not empty. It was a living thing, filled with questions, assumptions, and a fragile, burgeoning trust. Their conversations began with single words: water, pain, more. He spoke a broken, functional English learned from traders and soldiers, words stripped to their essential meanings. Clara, in turn, found herself pointing to objects and naming them. An impromptu teacher. Spoon, blanket, lamp. He would repeat the word, his tongue navigating the unfamiliar sounds, his gaze serious and intent. Each shared word was a small victory, a single stone laid in the foundation of a bridge between them. One evening, as she was changing his dressing, he spoke a full sentence: "You are not afraid." It was a statement, not a question. Clara paused, her hands hovering over his bandaged ribs. "I am terrified," she confessed, her voice low. "Of the marshal, of the town." "Not of me," he clarified. She looked at him then, truly looked at the man on the cot, not the warrior or the enemy. She saw the lines of pain and loss etched around his eyes. "No," she said softly, "not of you." That simple admission seemed to unlock something in him. Later, as the shadows grew long, he began to speak. His story came out in fragments, a mosaic of pain pieced together with his limited English and expressive gestures. He was not a raider. He had been traveling with his wife, his young son, and his brother's family. They were heading for a sacred canyon, a place of peace, not war. "White men," he said, his voice hard as flint. "Not soldiers, men with hair." He made a scalping motion, and a cold dread washed over Clara. The scalp hunters, the same kind of men she suspected had killed her father. He described the ambush. It was swift, brutal, and without honor. They came at dawn, their faces painted not with war paint, but with greed. He spoke of his wife, Neol, which he explained meant wind, and how she had fought with the fury of a cornered mountain cat. He spoke of his son, a boy of 6, whose name meant a little star. Tone's voice broke on the name. He turned his face to the wall, his broad shoulders shaking with a grief so profound it seemed to suck the very air from the room. Clara felt her own carefully constructed walls of grief begin to crumble. She saw not a Navajo savage, but a husband and father whose world had been stolen from him, just as hers had. The hatred she had nurtured for the people she blamed for her father's death felt suddenly hollow. A pointless, misdirected anger. The true enemy was the same for both of them, a senseless violence that wore a white man's face. She reached out, a hesitant, instinctive gesture, and placed her hand on his shoulder. He flinched at the contact but did not pull away. Through the rough fabric of his borrowed shirt, she could feel the tremors of his sorrow. They stayed that way for a long time. Two survivors from opposing sides of a war, united by a shared language of loss. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the hut changed. The roles of patient and healer began to blur. As he regained his strength, a quiet domesticity settled over them. He would watch her cook, his nose twitching at the unfamiliar smell of baking bread. She, in turn, found herself talking to him as she worked, telling him about her childhood. She spoke of her father, of his gentle hands and his endless curiosity. She described how he taught her the Latin names for every plant in the desert, how he believed that medicine was a sacred trust, a duty to preserve life, no matter whose it was. He was a good man, Toanes said one afternoon, after she'd finished a story about her father setting the broken leg of a stray dog. "The best," Clara whispered, her throat tight. "My father," Toanes said, "taught me to listen, not just with ears." He touched the side of his head. "Listen to the wind, the stones, the heart." He said a man who only listens to other men's words is half deaf. Clara found herself seeing the world beyond her window differently. The screech of a hawk was no longer just a sound. It was a message. The shape of a cloud was not random. It was a story. He was healing her, too. He was slowly, carefully, stitching together the parts of her spirit that had been torn apart by grief and isolation. Her feelings for him deepened into something she dared not name. It was a dangerous, forbidden affection, a tender shoot of life growing in the most barren soil imaginable. It bloomed in the small moments, the way his eyes would soften when she smiled, the brief, accidental brush of their hands as she gave him a cup of water, the shared understanding that passed between them in a single glance. But while a fragile peace grew within the hut, the world outside was growing more hostile. The story of the dead Navajo pony had taken root in the town's imagination and was now bearing poisonous fruit. Marshal Kane or Sheriff Kane, as he insisted on being called now that the county lines were officially drawn, had been re-energized by the incident. Clara saw him as the man he was: ambitious, deeply prejudiced, and smelling an opportunity. A successful Indian hunt would secure his position as the most powerful man in redemption. He was a wolf, and he had caught a scent. He formed a vigilance committee, a group of grim-faced ranchers and saloon regulars who were more a posse than a lawful militia. They began to patrol the outskirts of town, armed with rifles and a self-righteous certainty. Their presence was a constant, menacing drumbeat at the edge of Clara's awareness. She saw them questioning her neighbors, men who had known her since she was a child, and saw the way their eyes would flicker toward her little house. She was no longer just the odd spinster. She was a suspect. Her trips into town for supplies became ordeals. Mrs. Gable, the portly owner of the general store, who had once traded herbs for flour, now served her with a clipped, cold efficiency. Old man Hemlock, who sat perpetually on the porch of the saloon, would stop his whittling and watch her pass. His eyes small and hard. The air was thick with suspicion. One afternoon, Sheriff Harlan Kane paid her another visit. This time he did not come alone. He had two of his committee members with him, both large men who looked as if they were carved from granite. "Miss Whitmore," Kane began, foregoing any pretense of pleasantry. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry earth. "We have it on good authority that the Navajo who killed that army surgeon a year ago passed through this area. There's a bounty now, a federal bounty, $50 in gold for any man of that tribe brought in, dead or alive." Clara's blood ran cold. Asterisk the Navajo who killed that army surgeon. Her father, he was using her own tragedy as a weapon against her. $50 is a lot of money, Kane continued, his eyes like steel chips, enough to make a person observant, enough to make them report anything unusual, like a woman buying more bandages than she ought to need, or more food than a single person can eat. He knew. He didn't have proof, but he knew. Or at least, his gut told him so. And Harlan Kane was a man who trusted his gut. "I am a healer, Sheriff," Clara said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I always keep supplies." "Is that so?" Kane smirked. "Well, we'll be conducting a search. All properties on the edge of town. Standard procedure. For your own protection, of course. We'll start at the old Miller place and work our way here. Should be at your door by sunrise tomorrow." It was not a request. It was a death sentence. He turned and mounted his horse, his men following suit. As he rode away, he called over his shoulder, "Remember what I said, Miss Whitmore, $50. A person could do a lot with that. Could even buy a ticket on a stagecoach and leave a dusty little town like this far behind." The threat was clear. He was offering her a choice: betray the man in her house and receive a reward, or be discovered and face the consequences. For the first time, the full weight of her situation crashed down on her. It was no longer an abstract danger. It was Sheriff Kane and his men at her door. It was a rope. It was a bullet. She stumbled back inside, her heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. Tone was sitting up on the cot, his jaw set. He had heard everything. "I must go," he said, his voice a low rasp. He swung his legs over the side of the cot, testing his weight. He was still weak, the wound in his side pulling with every movement. "You can't," Clara cried. "You're not healed. You wouldn't make it a mile." "To stay is death. For you, too," he said, his eyes meeting hers. In them, she saw no fear, only a grim acceptance and a deep, aching concern for her. This was it, the choice she had been dreading. Her mind screamed at her to save herself. She could tell him to go. Let him take his chances in the desert. Or, God forgive her, she could walk into town and tell the sheriff where to find him. She could take the money and leave this whole nightmare behind. It was the sensible path, the path to survival. But as she looked at Tona, standing unsteadily in the center of her small home, she didn't see a Navajo warrior or a $50 bounty. She saw the man who had described the wind as his wife's soul, the man whose grief mirrored her own, the man who had taught her to listen to the stones. He had brought terror and danger into her life, but he had also brought a connection, a feeling of being truly seen, that had resurrected her from a half-life of lonely grief. To give him up would not just be a betrayal of him. It would be a betrayal of her father's memory, of every principle of healing and humanity he had ever taught her. It would be a betrayal of the woman she was becoming. "No," she said, her voice ringing with a certainty that surprised them both. "You will not go alone." She walked to the window and looked out at the path that led toward the dark, unforgiving mesas. "They will come for you at sunrise," she said, turning back to him. "So we will leave in darkness." The decision, once made, settled in the small hut like a third presence. It was a cold, sharp-edged thing that banished all exhaustion. There was no time for fear, only for action. The hours until sunrise were grains of sand slipping through their fingers. "We take only what we can carry," Tone said, his voice low and steady. The weakness was still there, a tremor beneath the surface, but his command was absolute. He was a warrior again, and this hut was now a battlefield they had to strategically abandon. Clara moved with a surgeon's efficiency, her mind sorting and discarding. She emptied a leather satchel, her father's old medical bag, and began to fill it with the essentials, not books, not keepsakes, but the currency of survival. Carbolic acid, linen bandages, her sharpest scalpel, a needle and catgut. She added a small tin of salve for burns and blisters, a packet of dried herbs for fever, life, and the tools to preserve it. Tone watched her, occasionally giving a curt nod or a quiet correction. He directed her to a small sack of jerky she had stored, and to the last of her dried apples. Water, he said, pointing to her canteen. Most important. While she filled it at her small basin, he worked on his moccasins, reinforcing a worn stitch with a piece of sinew he'd asked for. Every movement was deliberate, conserving energy. He taught her as he worked, his voice a low murmur against the night's silence. He showed her how to wrap strips of cloth around her own boots to muffle the sound of her footsteps. He took one of her dark wool blankets and, with a few deft folds and knots, turned it into a compact roll that could be slung over a shoulder. The desert is cold at night, he stated simply. Sun is your enemy in the day, cold is your enemy at night. As they worked, a new kind of intimacy formed between them, forged in the crucible of their shared purpose. There was no white woman or Navajo man, no healer or patient. There were only two people, preparing to pit their combined knowledge against a hostile world. He, the expert in the harsh language of the wilderness. She, the expert in the fragile mechanics of the human body. Each held the other's life in their hands. An hour before the first hint of dawn, they were ready. Tone stood, leaning slightly on a sturdy walking stick he had fashioned from a broom handle. Clara looked around the small hut, a wave of grief washing over her. It was the last piece of her father, the last remnant of her old life. She was leaving it all behind. There is no time to look back, Tone said gently, seeing the conflict in her eyes. The past is a ghost. It cannot carry you forward. He was right. She gave a single, sharp nod, slung her satchel over her shoulder, and unbarred the door. They slipped out into the deep, star-dusted darkness. The air was cool and carried the scent of dust and sage. Tone led the way, not toward the open plains, but into the jagged, broken land of the foothills, a chaotic maze of rock and shadow. He moved with a painful slowness, his wound a constant, grinding anchor. Yet, he moved with an unerring sense of direction. He taught her to place her feet on solid rock instead of loose gravel, to use the deep shadows of the mesas as their cloak. He showed her how to read the stars, not as distant, romantic lights, but as a map, a compass painted across the heavens. At sunrise, they found a shallow overhang and huddled together, watching the distant town of Redemption begin to stir in her mind's eye. Clara saw it all unfold, Sheriff Kane and his men arriving at her empty hut, the kicked-open door, the cold cot, the fury on the sheriff's face as he realized he'd been defied. Then, the discovery of their tracks, leading not into the open, but toward the unforgiving wilderness he commanded. The hunt was on. The next 2 days were a blur of torment and endurance. The sun was a hammer, beating down on them, stealing their moisture and their strength. Tone's wound, aggravated by the constant movement, began to fester. His fever returned, and there were times when Clara had to physically support him, her arm around his waist, his heat searing through her clothes. During these moments, their roles reversed entirely. She was the strong one, whispering encouragement, drawing on a reservoir of will she never knew she possessed. He, in turn, kept them alive. He found a hidden seep of water, a muddy patch of earth that Clara would have walked past without a glance. He showed her how to dig and line the hole with stones, waiting for the precious, murky water to collect. He identified a plant with a fleshy root that could be chewed for moisture. He taught her to listen to the wind, not for messages of the spirit, but for the practical signs of changing weather. His world was one of signs and portents, a text she was slowly, painfully learning to read. On the evening of the 3rd day, when Clara thought she could not take another step, he found it, a narrow slit in a rock face, almost invisible, hidden by a fall of scree and a gnarled juniper tree. It was the entrance to a small cave. Inside, it was cool and dark, and blessedly, there was the sound of dripping water. A tiny spring trickled from the rock wall, collecting in a clear, stone-carved basin. It was a miracle. It was a haven. They drank deeply, The cold, clean water a shock to their parched bodies. Then, Clara set about tending to Tone, in the dim light filtering through the entrance. She unwrapped his bandage. The wound was inflamed, the stitches pulling angrily at the skin. She cleaned it as best she could with their dwindling supply of carbolic acid and water, her touch as gentle as she could manage. He sat stoically, his back against the cool stone, his eyes closed, though she knew he was not sleeping. "I am sorry, Clara," he said, his voice thick with fever. "I have brought this upon you." "We brought it on each other," she replied softly, securing a fresh bandage around his ribs. "I made a choice to help you. You made a choice to trust me. We walked this path together." She finished her work and slumped down beside him, the exhaustion of the past days crashing over her in a tidal wave. They sat in silence, the only sound the steady, meditative drip, drip, drip of the spring. Here, in this hidden womb of the earth, the world of Sheriff Kane and his posse felt a universe away. There was only the stone, the water, and the shared warmth of their bodies. He reached out and took her hand. His was hot and dry, but his grip was firm. "You have the heart of a warrior," he murmured. Clara looked at their joined hands, his, dark and scarred from a life of conflict. Hers, pale and stained with his blood and desert dust. The barriers between them seemed not just foolish, but profane. In this moment of shared desperation, they were simply a man and a woman, stripped of their histories, bound by a profound and perilous connection. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her energy spent. He did not stiffen, but seemed to soften, accepting her weight. His arm came around her, pulling her close. The gesture was not one of passion, but of pure, desperate comfort, a mutual offering of solace in a world that offered none. But as they held each other in the gathering dark, something shifted. The comfort deepened into awareness, the shared warmth into a different kind of heat. Clara could feel the steady beat of his heart against her cheek, a rhythm that seemed to sync with her own. She lifted her head, and her eyes met his. The hunger she saw there was not just for food or water. It was a hunger for life, for connection, for a moment of grace in the face of annihilation. And she knew he saw the same need reflected in her own eyes. The world had stripped everything from them, their families, their homes, their futures. All they had left was this moment, this cave, this fragile, incandescent spark between them. It was a moment born of pain and intensity, of shared grief and the fierce, primal will to live. Clara leaned in, and the space between them vanished. The first touch of their lips was tentative, tasting of dust and water and sorrow. Then it deepened, becoming a desperate, searching kiss that spoke of all the words they couldn't say. It was a rebellion against the hatred that hunted them, an affirmation of life in the jaws of death. They came together not in a gentle union, but in a quiet, desperate collision. It was an act of profound intimacy, both fierce and tender, a clinging to the one solid thing in a world that had crumbled around them, in the cool, dark sanctuary of the cave, with a steady drip of the spring as their only witness. Clara Whitmore, the doctor's daughter from Redemption, and Tone, the Navajo warrior, found a fleeting, heartbreaking peace in each other's arms, their bodies creating a warmth that held the cold, lonely desert at bay. When they left the cave before the next dawn, something had irrevocably changed. The bond between them had been forged in blood and hardship, and now it had been sealed by an intimacy more powerful than any spoken vow. They were no longer fleeing from the past. They were running toward a future they would have to create together, one footprint at a time, with the sheriff's posse a dark shadow stretching ever longer behind them. The intimacy of the cave was a memory, a dream of water and coolness in a world that had once again become fire and dust. Leaving their sanctuary meant re-entering the furnace. The land they traveled was a testament to God's fury, A landscape of cracked earth, skeletal cactuses, and rocks that shimmered with a heat that promised death. Thirst became a constant companion, a dry, rasping presence in the back of their throats. Fear was the shadow that trailed them, a cold dread that not even the relentless sun could burn away. They moved at night, guided by Tone's celestial map, and hid during the day in whatever meager shade they could find. He grew weaker, the fever from his wound a constant, simmering fire, but his will was a thing of iron. He pushed onward. His focus narrowed to the next ridge, the next canyon, the next chance for survival. The bond forged between them in the cave was now the engine that drove them. They were a single entity, moving through the wasteland, her strength supporting his body, his knowledge guiding her feet. On their 5th day of flight, their water was gone, their lips were cracked, their tongues thick. The world had begun to waver at the edges, the heat creating phantom lakes on the horizon. Hope, like their water supply, had dwindled to its last, bitter drops. It was Tone who spotted the sign. A subtle shift in the vegetation, a line of hardy green shrubs clinging to the base of a canyon wall. "Water," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Somewhere close." The canyon was a deep, jagged scar in the earth. Entering it was a risk. The high walls offered shade, but also created a perfect trap. For a moment, they hesitated at its mouth, the instinct for self-preservation warring with their desperate thirst. But the thirst won. It always did. They descended into the cool shadows, their feet stumbling on loose rock. The air grew still, the silence profound after the constant whisper of the desert wind. They found it at the canyon's heart, a shallow, rock-lined pool of greenish water, fed by a slow, patient drip from the stone above. It was stagnant, but it was water. It was life. Clara fell to her knees, ready to plunge her face into it, but Tone's hand on her shoulder stopped her. "Wait," he commanded. He scanned the canyon rims. His eyes narrowed, every sense alert. He was a predator, sniffing the air for danger. The silence felt wrong. It was the silence of held breath. And then the world exploded. The crack of a rifle shot shattered the stillness, the sound bouncing off the canyon walls in a deafening echo. A chip of stone flew from the rock just beside Clara's head. She screamed, scrambling backward, her heart seizing in her chest. "Down!" Tone yelled, shoving her behind a massive boulder. Another shot rang out, then a third. Puffs of dust kicked up around them. They were pinned down. Above them, silhouetted against the brilliant blue sky, were the figures of men. Sheriff Harlan Kane and his posse. They had found them. "Nowhere to run. Whitmore." Kane's voice boomed down, distorted by the echo. "Give up the savage, and I'll let you live. I give you my word." Clara knew his word was worth less than the dust at her feet. She looked at Tone. His face was a grim mask, his hand clutching the hilt of the long knife at his belt, his only weapon. His rifle had been lost with his horse. "They will not take us," he said, his voice low and deadly serious. One of the deputies, a man named Miller, grew impatient and tried to get a better angle. Scrambling down a steep scree slope, he was careless. Tone saw his opening. He picked up a rock the size of his fist and hurled it with devastating accuracy. It struck Miller high on the chest, and the man tumbled backward with a cry, his rifle clattering down the slope. The distraction was all Toane needed. "Stay here," he ordered Clara, and before she could protest, he broke cover, sprinting across the open space toward the fallen rifle. It was a suicidal run. A volley of shots erupted from the rim, the bullets screaming past him. He ducked and weaved, a phantom of speed and desperation. He was almost there when a bullet caught him in the thigh. He cried out, his leg buckling beneath him, and he fell hard, just short of his goal. He was exposed, a sitting target. Sheriff Kane raised his own rifle, taking slow, deliberate aim. Time seemed to slow down. Clara saw the cold certainty on Kane's face, the glint of the sun on his rifle barrel. She saw Toane, struggling to rise, his life about to be extinguished. She did not think, she acted. With a cry of pure rage, she burst from behind the boulder and ran straight at Toane, putting her own body between him and the sheriff's rifle. "No!" she screamed. The world erupted in a flash of fire and a deafening roar. An immense force struck her in the shoulder, spinning her around and throwing her to the ground. A searing, white-hot pain shot through her. She lay in the dust, stunned, the metallic taste of blood and fear in her mouth. She had been hit. Her desperate, reckless act had saved him. Her sudden appearance had made Kane flinch, his shot going wide, the bullet only grazing her shoulder instead of finding its intended mark in Tone's chest. But the momentary distraction was all the warrior needed. With a roar that was more animal than human, Tone surged to his feet, ignoring the fire in his leg. He lunged the final few feet, snatched up the fallen deputy's rifle, and rolled behind a cluster of rocks in a single, fluid motion. He now had a weapon. The fight was now on his terms. What followed was a terrifying, lethal battle. Tone, now hidden in the rocks at the canyon floor, was in his element. He was a ghost, firing a single, well-aimed shot before melting away to a new position. The posse, exposed on the rim above, was at a disadvantage. One of them screamed as a bullet ricocheted and struck him. Another decided he wasn't being paid enough to die in this godforsaken canyon and scrambled away, disappearing over the rim. Soon, only Sheriff Kane was left. He was a proud, hateful man, and his fury at being defied by a woman and bested by a Navajo drove him past reason. He abandoned the high ground, sliding down the scree slope, his pistol drawn, determined to finish this face-to-face. Clara watched, helpless, from where she lay. Her shoulder was on fire, and a warm stickiness was spreading down her arm. But her pain was nothing compared to the terror that gripped her as she saw Kane stalking toward Tone's position. The rifle fell silent. It was out of ammunition. Kane laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Now it's just you and me, savage!" he snarled, kicking rocks aside as he advanced. Toane emerged from the shadows. He held his long knife in one hand, in the other, a heavy, jagged rock. He was limping badly, his face pale with pain and blood loss, but his eyes burned with a cold, unquenchable fire. The final battle was a thing of primitive, brutal violence. It was not a duel of honor. It was a desperate struggle for existence. Kane fired his pistol, but Tone threw himself sideways, the bullet whining past his ear. He threw the rock as he moved, catching Kane in the side of the head. The sheriff staggered, his hat flying off, a dark line of blood appearing at his temple. Dazed but not down, Kane lunged, swinging the heavy barrel of his pistol like a club. Tone ducked under the blow and drove his knife into the sheriff's thigh. Kane roared in pain and fury, grabbing Tone's wrist, forcing the knife away. They fell to the ground together, a tangle of limbs, grunts, and curses. Clara could only watch in horror. It was a chaotic, bloody dance. They rolled in the dust, each man straining for dominance. Kane had size and brute strength. Tone had speed and a lifetime of fighting for his life. The sheriff managed to pin Tone, his thick hands closing around the warrior's throat. Tone's face began to darken, his legs kicking uselessly. "I told you I'd see you hang." Kane grunted, spittle flying from his lips. He squeezed harder, his face a mask of triumphant hatred. Clara screamed, trying to push herself up, but her body wouldn't obey. This was it. It was over. But Kane, in his moment of victory, made a fatal error. His grip on Tone's knife hand had loosened, with the last of his strength, fueled by the image of Clara lying wounded in the dust. Tone twisted his wrist and drove the tip of the blade upward, into the soft flesh under the sheriff's arm. Kane's eyes went wide with shock. A choked, gurgling sound escaped his throat. His hands fell away from Tone's neck. He stared down at the knife hilt protruding from his side as if in disbelief. Then he looked at Tone, his hateful eyes glazing over with the finality of death. He collapsed sideways, a dead weight, and lay still. The canyon fell into a ringing silence, broken only by Tone's ragged, desperate gasps for air. He had won. He had survived. He rolled away from the sheriff's body and tried to push himself up, but his strength failed him. The adrenaline that had sustained him drained away, leaving only an ocean of pain. His leg was a mess of blood and torn muscle. The wound in his side, the one Clara had so carefully stitched, had been ripped open in the struggle. He collapsed onto the dusty floor of the canyon. A second, grievously wounded man lying only feet from the first. Clara finally found her strength, crying his name. She crawled, then stumbled, to his side. The triumphant climax had lasted only a moment, replaced by a desperate, terrifying reality. They were alive, but they were broken, and they were still alone in the heart of the wilderness. The silence that descended upon the canyon was heavier than the heat. It was a silence made of echoes, the ghost of gunfire, the final, choked gasp of a dying man, the ragged sound of two people fighting for breath. For a long moment, Clara could only lie in the dust, the fiery pain in her shoulder a distant thing compared to the roaring in her ears. Then, a low groan from Tone broke the spell. It was the sound that had started it all. Back in a sandstorm that now felt a lifetime ago, it was the call of the healer's duty, a sound that cut through her own pain and shock. Pushing herself up with her good arm, she scrambled to his side. The sight of him stole the air from her lungs. He was pale beneath his sun-darkened skin, a waxy, translucent color that she knew from her father's clinic was the hue of profound blood loss. The bullet wound in his thigh was a dark, pulsing wellspring. Worse, the violent struggle had torn open her careful stitches, and the old wound in his side was bleeding freely again. He was dying, here, in the dust, at the feet of the man he had killed. He was dying. A fierce, protective rage surged through Clara, eclipsing her fear. She had not dragged this man from a storm, lied to a sheriff, abandoned her home, and run for her life just to watch him die now. "No," she said aloud, the word a harsh command to fate itself. "You will not die." Her medical satchel lay a few feet away. Miraculously intact, she crawled to it, her vision swimming. The world was a dizzying canvas of red rock and blue sky. She ignored her own bleeding shoulder. Her injury was a nuisance. His were a death sentence. She became her father's daughter again. Her movements, though clumsy with pain, were precise. She took her last strip of clean linen and pressed it hard against the gushing wound in his thigh. "Hold this," she ordered, placing his own hand on the makeshift compress. His fingers were weak, but he obeyed. The wound in his side was her gravest concern. It was a deep, complex injury she had barely managed to close in the relative calm of her hut. Now, it was ripped open. Contaminated with the dirt and grime of the fight, there was no time for delicacy. She poured the last of her whiskey over it. Tone arched in a silent scream, his body convulsing, but he did not lose consciousness. That, at least, was a good sign. Her needle and catgut, her hands were shaking, slippery with blood. She bit her lip, forcing them still. This was not her quiet clinic with its clean lamplight. Her operating table was the unforgiving earth. Her only light was the cruel, indifferent sun. Her patient was the man she could not finish the thought. To name the feeling was a vulnerability she could not afford. She began to stitch. It was a brutal, ugly process. She pulled the torn flesh together, pushing the needle through skin and muscle, her own pain a dull throb in the background of her intense concentration. She was no longer Clara Whitmore. She was a machine dedicated to a single purpose, closing the holes from which his life was escaping. She worked for what felt like an eternity, sweat and tears stinging her eyes. She lost track of time, of the dead man lying nearby, of the vultures that had begun to circle high overhead. There was only the needle, the thread, and the rise and fall of Tone's shallow breathing. When she had done all she could, she bandaged him as tightly as possible, using strips of fabric torn from the dead sheriff's shirt. It was a grim, practical irony. The man who had hunted them would now help keep his quarry alive. Finally, she tended to herself. The bullet had torn through the flesh of her shoulder, a clean but painful wound. She washed it with the last of the water from the pool and bandaged it tightly. Exhausted, she collapsed beside Tone. He was unconscious now, but his breathing was a little deeper. The bleeding stemmed. He was alive. For now, she had pulled him back from the precipice. A second time. They remained in the canyon, their prison and their sanctuary. For 4 days, it was a hallucinatory time, a purgatory of heat, pain, and recovery. Clara diligently kept their wounds clean with water from the spring. She scavenged what she could from the bodies of Kane and his deputy, a rifle with a full ammunition belt, 2 pistols, a sturdy knife, 2 canteens, and a small pouch of coins. The grim harvest felt like a violation, but she knew it was their only chance. On the second day, she used the recovered rifle to shoot a desert hare, her first time ever firing a gun. She cooked the meat over a small, smokeless fire Tone H. had taught her how to build, and forced the broth between his lips. He woke on the 3rd day, lucid and aware. He looked at her, then at the body of the sheriff, which she had dragged to the far side of the canyon. He looked at his own neatly bandaged wounds. "You saved me," he said. His voice was weak, but the words were clear. "We saved each other," she corrected him. A long silence settled between them, filled with the weight of all that had happened. The violence, the intimacy, the shared flight. They were no longer the same people who had met in the storm. The desert had burned away their old lives, leaving them scarred, altered, and irrevocably bound together. "What now, Clara?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. The question hung in the still air. She looked north, in the direction of redemption. The word home was a bitter ash in her mouth. "I can't go back," she said. "They would call me a traitor, an accomplice to the killing of a lawman. There would be a trial, but the verdict was decided the moment I ran. They would hang me." Tone looked south, toward the lands of his own people. The Dain. A profound sadness filled his eyes. "I cannot go back either," he said. "I have killed a sheriff. They will not stop hunting me. If I return to my people, I bring the blue coats with me. I bring soldiers and death. I would be a curse upon my own family." There it was, the truth, stark and undeniable. They were exiles, ghosts, people without a place. She could not return to the white world, and he could not return to the Navajo world. They were adrift in the vast, unforgiving land between. They sat with that devastating realization, the weight of their shared homelessness pressing down on them. They had won the battle, but in doing so, they had lost everything they had ever known. On the 4th day, as Tone sat propped against a rock, Clara saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not despair, but the faint, stubborn glint of a plan. "There is a place," he said slowly, as if testing the memory. "I heard of it, many seasons ago, from a Ute man I traded with. He called it Tres Cruces." 3 crosses, Clara translated. "Yes, it is not a town, not a fort. It is a place for those who have no place." He described it as a hidden settlement, nestled deep in the borderlands where the territories of the Americans, the Mexicans, and the free tribes bled into one another. It was a refuge for the dispossessed Mexicans who had been driven from their lands, Apache who had refused the reservations, white men who had run from the law. It was a community of outcasts, held together by a single, Unspoken rule: leave the past behind and ask no questions. It may be nothing. Tony H. warned. A ghost story. Or it may have been wiped out years ago. It's a chance, Clara said, latching onto the sliver of hope. It's more than we have now. They found a horse belonging to the posse, still grazing placidly at the canyon's mouth. The journey to Tres Cruces was a slow, painful pilgrimage. Clara rode, while Tona, still too weak for a saddle, walked beside her, leaning on the horse for support. They traveled for a week, navigating through a landscape of towering mesas and sun-bleached plains, following the vague directions of Tona's memory. Finally, they saw it, tucked into a wide, fertile valley. Protected on three sides by sheer rock walls, was a small collection of adobe buildings and rough-looking jackals. A thin plume of smoke rose from a chimney, the only sign of life. It looked hard-bitten and weary, but it was there. It was real. As they approached, a door opened, and a woman emerged. She was old, her face a beautiful, creased map of a long and difficult life. She held a shotgun in the crook of her arm, her dark eyes missing nothing. "State your business," she said, her English heavily accented with Spanish. Clara slid from the horse, her heart pounding. "We need a place to rest," she said. "We mean no harm. He is injured. I am a healer." The old woman's eyes flickered from Clara's pale, determined face to Tona's grim, exhausted one. She took in their ragged clothes, the fresh bandages, the haunted look in their eyes. She had seen countless people like them before. She was one of them herself. Her gaze lingered on Clara's satchel. "A healer?" she asked, a note of interest in her voice. "Our last one died of fever 2 winters ago." Just then, a small child ran out from another doorway, coughing, a dry, racking sound. The old woman's face softened with concern. Clara didn't hesitate. She went to her satchel, pulled out her small packet of horehound and mullein, and knelt by the child. She spoke in a soft, soothing voice, showing the child how to chew the leaves to soothe his throat. The old woman watched, her expression unreadable. She looked at Tona, who stood silently, a silent, watchful guardian. She saw not a savage, but a man protecting his own. After a long moment, she rested her shotgun against the wall. "My name is Elena," she said. "The boy is my grandson." She gestured toward a small, empty adobe hut at the edge of the settlement. "You can stay there, for now. We have little to share, but you are welcome to what we have." Clara felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees. She looked at Tona, and he gave her a small, weary nod. It was not redemption. It was not his family's Hogan. It was a dusty, forgotten corner of the world, filled with broken people. But for the first time in a very long time, it felt like a beginning. It felt like they might have found a home. The seasons turned in Tres Cruces, marked not by a calendar, but by the angle of the sun and the character of the wind. Summer's brutal heat softened into the crisp, clear air of autumn. The small, hidden valley became a world unto itself, a pocket of existence where the laws of the outside world held no sway. Here a person was judged not by the color of their skin or the god they prayed to, but by the strength of their hands and the truth in their eyes. Life settled into a rhythm that was both demanding and deeply peaceful. Clara, with her medical knowledge, became the heart of the community. She was no longer an oddity. She was asterisk la curandera asterisk, the healer. She delivered babies, set the broken bones of a careless vaquero, and mixed poultices for fevers, receiving payment in corn, venison, or a bolt of precious cloth. Her hands, once soft and suited for turning the pages of a book, grew calloused and capable. She found a purpose here that redemption, with its rigid judgments, would have never allowed her. Tona, in turn, became the valley's silent guardian. He hunted with a quiet, deadly efficiency, his knowledge of the wilderness providing fresh meat for the community's cook fires. He taught the younger men how to track, how to read the subtle signs of the desert. He rarely spoke of his past, but his presence was a steady, powerful force. The trauma he carried was a shadow within him, but here, in the sun and the work, it seemed to recede. He began to smile again. Small, rare smiles that were reserved only for Clara and felt more precious than gold. Their small adobe hut became a home. He patched the leaking roof with mud and straw. She planted a small garden of herbs and hardy chilies by the door. In the evenings, they would sit together, the silence comfortable, their hands often finding each other in the twilight. They were two broken pieces of different worlds that, against all odds, had found a way to fit together, creating something new and whole. It was in the early winter, when the nights grew long and cold, that Clara first felt the change within herself, a morning sickness that she initially dismissed as a lingering fever, a profound weariness that settled deep in her bones. As a healer, she knew the signs intimately. As a woman, she was terrified. She was pregnant. The realization brought a dizzying, chaotic storm of emotions. There was a surge of fierce, primal joy, a feeling so intense it almost brought her to her knees. A child, a new life, conceived not in hatred or violence, but in a moment of desperate, clinging love. A child that was a part of her and a part of him, a living symbol of their impossible union. But on the heels of that joy came a wave of ice-cold fear. What right did she have to bring a child into this life, a life on the run, a life in the shadows? This child would be an outcast from birth, belonging to neither the white world nor the Navajo. It would be a target, a half-breed, a creature of two worlds, at home in none. The anxiety was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, stealing her breath. She waited a week, the secret a heavy stone in her heart, before she told him. They were sitting outside their hut one evening, watching the last of the sun's fire fade from the mesa tops. "Tone," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I have something to tell you." He turned to her, his dark eyes instantly alert to the tremor in her voice. He waited, his patience a tangible thing. "I am with child," she said, the words coming out in a rush. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a terrifying moment, she thought he would be angry, that he would see it as a burden, another complication in their precarious existence. She saw the ghost of his first family, of his lost son, and wondered if this news was a pain too great to bear. Then, slowly, he reached out and placed his hand on her belly. His touch was incredibly gentle, reverent. When she looked at his face, she saw that the stone-like mask had crumbled. Tears were tracing clean paths through the dust on his cheeks. "Niall, my wife," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She said a child is a bridge, from the ancestors of the past to the spirits of the future. It is the reason we walk the earth. He looked from her belly to her eyes, and his own were filled with a light she had never seen before. "It is a blessing," he whispered. "You have given me back the world." In that moment, Clara's fear did not vanish, but it was dwarfed by a love so fierce and protective it felt like a shield. They would face the world together, for this child. It was Elena, the old matriarch, who suggested the wedding. "A child should be born under a blessed roof," she said, her eyes kind. "It does not matter which blessing. God, the spirits, they are all just names for the same great mystery." And so, they were married on a clear, cold day under the vast desert sky. The entire community of Tres Cruces gathered, their family of outcasts. It was a ceremony of their own making, a tapestry woven from the threads of their two lives. An old man named Ricardo, who had once been a priest in Mexico before a scandal sent him fleeing north, read a simple blessing from a tattered Bible. Then, Tony, his voice strong and clear, performed the Navajo rites. He took a handful of sacred corn pollen and touched it to Clara's forehead, her lips, and her heart, blessing her journey. They shared a bowl of blue corn mush, a symbol of the life they would now build together, their hands touching on the rim. They exchanged no rings, only a solemn, silent vow in the gaze they held. They were bound not by a law or a church, but by shared blood, shared hope, and a shared future. Months passed. Clara's belly swelled. A fragile, hard-won peace settled over them, but they both knew the outside world had not forgotten them. The arrival of the new lawman was quiet, unassuming. He was not like Cain. He rode into the valley alone, on a tired-looking horse. He was an older man, with a weary face and eyes that had seen too much. He introduced himself as U.S. Marshal Emmett Brody. He was there, he said, investigating the disappearance of Sheriff Harlan Kane and his posse. Panic, cold and familiar, seized Clara. But Toana stood calmly before their home, his hand resting on her shoulder, a silent message of strength. Marshal Brody was methodical. He spoke to Elena first, then to Ricardo. He had a way of asking questions that was not threatening, but deeply perceptive. By the time he approached Clara and Tone, it was clear he already knew, or suspected, most of the truth. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat to Clara, "folks in Redemption say you disappeared the same night Sheriff Kane went looking for a renegade Navajo, a healer. They said you were, funny thing, finding a healer out here." His eyes fell on Tone, taking in the faint, silvery scars on his side and the slight limp in his walk. "And folks in Fort Defiance lost track of a Navajo warrior named Tone around the same time, a man whose entire family was killed by scalp hunters." He looked at the body of Sheriff Kane's horse, which they had kept. He looked at the rifle propped against their wall. The pieces were all there. "He killed a lawman," Brody stated, his voice flat, without judgment. "And you helped him. The law on that is clear." Clara's hand went instinctively to her swollen belly. This was it. The past had finally caught up to them. Toana stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Brody and Clara. "What happened in that canyon," he said, his English clear and steady, "was between that man and me. She is not a part of it." Marshal Brody looked from Tona's defiant face to Clara's terrified one. He saw her condition. His gaze softened, just for a moment, and a deep weariness seemed to settle over him. "The law is clear," he repeated, but this time it sounded less like a verdict and more like a regret. He sighed, a long, heavy sound, and looked out at the valley, at the small, hard-scrabble community of people who had nowhere else to go. "I had a sister," Brody said suddenly, his voice quiet, almost to himself. "Younger than me. Smartest person I ever knew. She fell in love with a coal miner from Pennsylvania. Our father, he was a banker. He forbade it, said the man was beneath her, dirt under his fingernails." He shook his head slowly. "So, she ran off with him. We never heard from her again. My father, he died with his heart full of pride and his house empty of love. Sometimes, the law, and what folks think is right, it just breaks things, breaks them so they can't ever be fixed." He looked back at them, and in his eyes, Clara saw not an executioner, but a man haunted by his own ghosts. He saw a pregnant woman, a protective husband, a life that was about to begin. He saw the chance for a different ending to an old, sad story. He turned his horse around. "My report will say that Sheriff Kane and his men rode into a box canyon and were ambushed by an Apache war party," he said, not looking at them. "No survivors. A damn tragedy." He paused, his back still to them. "The world is a hard enough place," he said, his voice rough. "No sense in me making it any harder." And with that, he rode out of the valley, never looking back, a lone, weary figure disappearing into the vast indifference of the desert. He left behind a silence filled not with fear, but with a profound, unbelievable sense of peace. The baby was born in the late summer, a boy with Clara's fair skin and a shock of Tone's jet-black hair. They named him Hozo, a Navajo word that meant peace, balance, beauty, and harmony. It was everything they wished for him. The story ends not with a gunshot, but with a sunset. Clara and Tona sit on a bench outside their home. The day's work done. The sky is a riot of orange, pink, and purple. The colors bleeding into the majestic landscape of the mesas and canyons that had once been their prison and was now their sanctuary. In Clara's arms, the baby sleeps, his small chest rising and falling in the gentle rhythm of a life just beginning. Tone's arm is around her, a solid, comforting weight. They don't speak. They don't need to. They watch the last of the light fade, the first stars beginning to prick the deep velvet of the sky. Here, in this forgotten valley, two outcasts, a healer and a warrior, have found their place. They have built a home, not of adobe and wood, but of a love that was strong enough to survive the fire. And in the quiet peace of the coming night, they hold the future in their arms. The sun sets and the sky bleeds. This is the first and last truth of the desert. It is a land of harsh endings and beautiful, violent goodbyes. For Clara and Tone, sitting on the bench before their small home in Tres Cruces, it is also a promise, the end of one day, the promise of another. In the cradle of Clara's arms, their son, Hozo, breathes the cool evening air, a small, warm anchor in the vastness of the world. His existence is a testament to a story that began in the crucible of a sandstorm, a story not of conquest or gold, but of the stubborn, resilient territory of the human heart. Their story, in its essence, is a defiance of the lines drawn in the sand. In the world they fled, life was a map of divisions. There was the town and the wilderness, the fort and the reservation, the lawman and the outlaw, the white man and the Navajo. These lines were meant to be borders, walls that kept people separate, safe in their own hatreds and suspicions. Redemption was a town built on such lines, its very name a bitter irony in a place that offered so little of it. It was a world that saw Clara as a spinster meddling in a man's world and saw Tone as a savage, a faceless part of a feared and hated whole. Love, in such a world, was not just an emotion, it was a transgression, an act of rebellion. It was a crossing of borders that was punishable by death. But love is a river. It does not recognize the lines drawn on a map. It flows where it will, carving its own path through the hardest stone. For Clara and Tone, it began not as a gentle stream, but as a flash flood of necessity and compassion. In the howling chaos of the storm, Clara saw not an enemy, but a wounded man. In the quiet vulnerability of his healing, Tone saw not a white woman, but a healer with a warrior's spirit. They saw the person, not the label. This simple, profound act of seeing was the foundation of everything that followed. Their love story asks a timeless question. What is true justice? Is it the rigid, unbending law of a man like Sheriff Kane, a law fueled by prejudice and personal ambition, or is it found in the quiet, difficult choice to see another's humanity, even when the world tells you not to? Sheriff Kane represented a brutal, simple kind of order. His justice was the justice of the rope and the gun, a system designed to maintain the lines, to punish any who dared to cross them. To him, Tone was guilty by virtue of his birth, and Clara was guilty by her act of compassion. Yet, the story offers another model of justice in the weary form of Marshal Emmett Brody. He, too, was a man of the law, a man who understood its clear and unforgiving letter. But his life had taught him a harder lesson that sometimes the law breaks more than it fixes. He saw in Clara and Tone not a criminal and his accomplice, but an echo of his own family's tragedy, a story of love condemned by pride. His decision to ride away, to write a different story in his official report, was not a failure of law. It was a triumph of a higher, more complex humanity. He chose to see them with his heart, and in doing so, he allowed a future to be born. He understood that true justice is not always about punishment, but sometimes about creating the space for peace to grow. This journey toward a more profound understanding of the world is, at its core, a story of transformation. The Clara Whitmore who stepped out into the sandstorm was not the same woman who now holds her child in the twilight. The first Clara was a prisoner of her grief, of her loneliness, and of the suffocating expectations of her society. She was Dr. Whitmore's daughter, a role that defined and limited her. Her skills were a secret, her heart was a fortress. The desert, the flight, the fight. These things were a crucible that burned away the woman she was supposed to be and forged the woman she truly was. She discovered a strength she never knew she possessed, not just the strength to heal a body, but the strength to defy a town, to protect a life, and to choose her own path. She shed the skin of conformity and emerged as a woman of immense courage, a self-reliant healer, a wife, and a mother who built her home far from the world that had tried to break her. Toane's transformation is no less profound. We first meet him as a man remade by loss. His identity was that of a warrior, but a warrior whose family had been slaughtered, leaving him with nothing but the burning coal of vengeance in his heart. His hatred for the white men who had destroyed his world was a shield, the only thing protecting the raw wound of his grief. His fight with Sheriff Kane was the climax of this old story, the final, bloody chapter of the warrior seeking retribution. But his true victory was not in the killing of his enemy. His true victory came in the quiet moments that followed the choice to trust Clara, to build a new life, to become a father again. He let go of the ghosts of the past, not to forget them, but to make space for a future. He traded the path of the avenger for the path of the builder. He laid down the warrior's knife and picked up the husband's hand, finding a new kind of strength not in fighting, but in protecting the fragile peace he and Clara had created. Throughout their journey, from the first touch in the storm-ravaged hut to the quiet evenings in Tres Cruces, a single, powerful symbol weaves its way through their story, the act of seeing, of keeping one's eyes open. It began with Clara's desperate, self-conscious whisper, "Close your eyes." It was a plea to retreat into the safety of their assigned roles, to pretend that the forbidden intimacy of a white woman tending to a Navajo warrior was not happening. It was a request to be blind to the truth. But they never truly closed their eyes. Toane watched her, his gaze unwavering. As she washed and stitched his flesh, he refused to look away, to grant her the comfort of anonymity. In that shared gaze, they were forced to see each other not as symbols, but as vulnerable, breathing human beings. They kept their eyes open through the grueling flight across the desert, seeing the shared desperation and the growing reliance on one another. They saw each other in the dark of the cave, their kiss an acknowledgement of a truth too powerful to ignore. They had to look upon the face of death in the canyon, to see the ugliness of Kane's hatred and the terrible price of their survival. They refused to be blind. They chose to see the truth, no matter how painful, no matter how dangerous. And because they kept their eyes open to each other, they were able to see a path forward when none seemed to exist. Their son, Hosho, is the ultimate testament to this clear-eyed love. A child born not of ignorance or illusion, but of a truth that was looked upon, accepted, and embraced. And so, their ending is one of peace, but it is a peace that retains the faint, bitter aftertaste of all they have lost. It is not a fairy tale. They cannot reclaim their old lives. Their happiness is a small, flickering candle in a vast and often dark wilderness. They are exiles, and their son will be born into that exile, a citizen of a country that does not yet exist, a nation of two. This is the story's lingering tragedy, but it is also its deepest source of beauty. The light of their small family shines all the brighter for the immense darkness it holds at bay. Their love is not a simple, easy thing. It is a hard-won, scarred, and profoundly beautiful thing. It is a shelter built from the wreckage of two broken lives. And it is stronger than any fortress of stone. It is like the desert sunset, a thing of breathtaking beauty born from a harsh and unforgiving landscape. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If this tale of the Wild West touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please support us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us and allows us to keep these tales alive.